Okay, first of all, I'm going to put my Patreon into the chat. It's also in the bottom of the description for those interested. This one, we're going to basically take a look at the Venezuelan power failure and see who's to blame. We're going to look at this more like an actual criminal case to see who's to blame. Now, we need to look at this thing a little bit in an interesting manner. Now, one of the things that was actually quite interesting is that we need to look at on statements from people is Marco Rubio actually stated that the backup generators had failed. Well, when it comes down to it, is what we know with it. This is a piece of evidence, mind you, that he had stated this, and people did not know this. Nobody had known this at the actual time. Now, how did he know this? Now, first of all, he's not even out there. How would he have known this? Now, this would have only been divulged through some type of intelligence meeting. This means that he got this through and he would have been one of the few members that have been privy to intelligence. When they do these intelligence meetings, they usually give it to maybe about eight or so members of both, totaling both houses, and they really limit the number of people who can actually see this specialized intelligence of what they're actually doing. Now, how did he know that these backup generators actually failed? Now, and this was before anybody else out there knew this. This is before the media knew this. This is before this was even well before this was actually known. And nobody actually knew this out there, and this was actually shown. Now, this means that he essentially is culpable. He essentially would have to be listed as one of the people culpable on this actual act. And this means that there's something culpable on the United States side. Now, I'm not saying that what it called that, oh, the United States is bad is an evil country, but we need to look at things realistically. And in this case with it, we need to look at what's going on. This is a thing where we have these neoconservatives and neoliberals basically wanting to essentially overthrow an actual government. And they want to put their guy in, and they know that basically under the current situations that it can't happen, and they know that basically if they send in troops, it's going to basically look very bad, and people are going to get very angry about it, and it's going to affect the elections in 2020 because they know that it could flip, and they don't want essentially someone who could possibly have advisors who are not going to bring them in. They don't want someone who's basically going to kick them out and tell them they're not wanted whatsoever, and possibly start reducing the amount of money that they're getting and start cutting ties with countries that that the neoconservatives and neoliberals have had ties with, that are funding this whole big scam of money going back and forth. Now, this is why they want to go in a more covert manner. Now, this should be easily seen with it as a plausibility, because the U.S. was even having concerns over, can our electrical grid be hacked into? And when we look at the case of Venezuela, if the U.S. grid could have been hacked into from any potential other foreign nations, we need to assume that that a country under socialism, which is not going to have the amount of security that other nations are, they should automatically assume that Venezuela is going to be much easier to hack into their uh, electrical grid and to basically do a massive amount of damage. And even if the idea of if it's not as easy to do it from the American end because of security, we have to automatically assume that they had the idea of being able to do it for regime change for other nations, and that's why the idea even popped up. And that should be a huge idea when it comes down to this. So when it comes down to these people, is we need to understand that is when this point came across, when Marco Rubio actually bring up that point, this is something that was brought forth by Ava Bartlett, uh, who is a who is a writer, and it's was brought to the to actually got the information out to Daniel McAdams, who is the head of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Now, when we look at it, is we look at that information, we can definitely see that there's something going on there, and this is something very, very interesting. And we need to understand that in these cases, that if something, if you're basically have a piece of information that should not be known to the public, and that is not known at all, and is well before anybody else knows it, you could say that the person is definitely in on this crime. It doesn't matter what crime we're talking about. Basically, when we go back to cases of homicide, if there's someone who basically has information about the actual case, such as basically what killed the person, like what weapon killed the person, how the person was lying there, or whatever with it without actually being there, and if they start stating these things that only the police know, or basically only the actual like investigators or something know, then basically you know that person's involved. And this is basically a case where when it comes down to this one, is this is something where we have a person, Marco Rubio, who is stating something that only the people who are involved would have known it at that time. And nobody else would have known that the backup generators had failed other than the people who had committed the act. Because he's not a Venezuelan official. He's an American senator from the state of Florida. The only people who would have known that the backup generators had failed with it would have basically it would have been most likely assumed from the Venezuelan side, but not necessarily known. But it would have been known from the perpetrators, and it would actually have been known from these perpetrators, and it would have been also known from uh, it would have been known from basically any perpetrators of the crime. And basically this is the only people who would have known in advance, because the people in Venezuela would not have known from this point because of the fact of what was really going on. They wouldn't have known with it. They would have assumed so, but not actually known. So this means that he is essentially, because he would have been one of the people privy to this intelligence knowledge, he would have essentially been privy to the knowledge of what the United States intelligence was doing. And since we see Juan Guaido is a person that's basically been trained in basically intervention in a regime overthrowing, as well as him having a basically essentially a CIA handler from the United States currently, as well as we have the envoy to the United States being a person that's essentially done all these things of regime change, being Elliot Abrams. When we start to look at this thing, this is showing that that's the exact purpose. Do we think that Trump's essentially involved? No, because I think Trump is checked out when it comes to a lot of things in foreign policy, with exceptions of trying to at least get some type of thing of getting people to exit. But I think he's checked out on a lot of things for foreign policy and handed that over to John Bolton. And when we know some of the history of John Bolton, we know that what he is he does not like any peace process. He does not like any peace treaty because he feels it binds the actual government. And when we start to look at the actual players involved, is there were people like the reason why Mattis was removed was rightfully so, that Mattis was essentially part of the swamp, and Mattis wanted more intervention. But the fact is with when we see these changes, it's he added when he added on people like John Bolton. John Bolton essentially took over and is leading Trump to have only what the highlights of intelligence are. He's screening through 100% of the intelligence and only giving Trump what he wants Trump to see, which means he's giving Trump basically this highlight, and this highlight might even be essentially not even true intelligence, just to basically create this vision of what the intelligence really is, and essentially lying to Trump to make Trump think that he has to reverse course on some things because of his actual Bolton's worldview. Now, when it comes down to the rest of this thing with it, is we need to see the other people who actually share this worldview with Bolton. When we look at Marco Rubio is another neoconservative, just like John Bolton, and he would be another person that would, when it comes down to us. Now, when we look at the people who are actually privy to the knowledge that they give in Congress, it's only people who share this view of intervention. And the reason why is because they don't want to allow people who do not share this view to have access to that information. If they were to do so, then this would actually screw up the ideas of plans that they actually want, because there's other countries that actually rely on us trying to intervene, and they want this. And if we were to essentially change who had information to this to the highest levels of intelligence from congressional members, they would actually cause a massive change in how things were done, and they don't want this to actually change. And this is essentially going on at the international level as well, and that's a major point that needs to be brought forth, because there's a lot of other countries who to basically rely on us that are they consider themselves as allies of the United States. They rely on us to fund their militaries, to basically fund all these wars that they want, and to recarve up the world in the ways that they want. And this is the thing is that this is why these people essentially never change, or the ideas never change of these positions. And it's something very, very interesting. Now, when it comes down to what we see with like what Marco Rubio was stating, well, you could pretty much follow that straight back to the same type of people that he was that he has the same ideas as. And it goes down to the people who are basically uh, you you would fall back to basically the same people who has the same ideas. And when it comes down to it, just look at Marco. Just look at who Marco Rubio is was bringing on as advisors from during his presidential campaign. He was one of many people who bring advisors through the John Hay Initiative. The John Hay Initiative is basically referred to by Daniel McAdams as the Walmart of neoconservative advisors. So when we're talking about that, is we need to understand that basically is he was if he's basically bringing on these people and this is his whole idea of what he believes, we need to assume that any type of neoconservative that's actually worked their way into the administration, which there's a lot of people that have, and these were essentially these never Trumpers. And these are the same people that have worked their way into the administration. They're not just on the first level, but first level and second level administration people that have essentially worked their way in. And these are the ones that essentially are the ones that embrace the ideas of intervention. And when it comes down to it, is this is really when we're talking about the plausibility of trying to cause intervention through an alternative method. Now, why do we know that this is that this is a possibility? Well, when we look at the basically the prank phone call to Elliot Abrams that was released with it, where you had a couple of Russians pretending to be Swiss diplomats. Elliot Abrams released that we basically just want to make the people in the current government nervous, and not to make the Congress nervous. Well, what he was referring to the Congress, he didn't mean the Congress in general. He meant basically these people that were neoconservatives. He was That's what he was really referring to. He essentially wanted to deliver this essential change to Juan Guaido, but he within a good pace, but he wanted to do so without using the military, which would have had a negative impact to the election, because they know that would have a very, very negative impact to the election, because people are going to start screaming about it, and they're going to want to basically and it would cause Trump loss and a definite Democrat win, when Trump has an actual huge advantage from what people are stating in the outputs from different outlets out there. That's from what's actually out there in the political parties. It comes down to what's their options of military intervention is pretty much off the table, and this is even something that was even noted by Elliot Abrams. So the idea is to take every other drastic measure to basically cause regime change, and this would be one of those drastic measures, because if you look, the actual outcome of what they've tried to do through other measures, trying to essentially validate the military coming in and causing a quick switch from the actual case of, like, let's say if Guaido were to get arrested, they could have, and when they referred to him as the acting president, this was essentially to get him, if he got arrested, then he could have essentially been, they could have said, oh, they arrested the acting president, and and this is an act of basically tyrannical, of basically being a tyrant and not not giving up power when you're no longer the president of the country, and they could have essentially tried to convince the American people that they needed to go in and reestablish order in the country. And that was another alternative plan they had, but essentially that kind of blew up when Maduro did not take their bait. So the actual option after that was this is what ended up happening. We saw that what ended up happening out here with this one was that we see that we have a uh, power failure that essentially just goes down to the idea that yes, you can hack into the actual grid, because we see that when it comes down to it is the references that Marco Rubio was making essentially confirm guilt. And he essentially released a lot of information out there of what they were doing. And that's essentially giving out everything that they were really not supposed to be doing. Which means that yes, you can hack into a grid when it was considered to be not really plausible by many, but yes, you can hack into a grid. Yes, you can shut down these generators for electricity and make them essentially overload and explode. And it shows with it when they're trying to say, "Oh, Maduro doesn't care about the people." Well, look what we just did. We know the United States government just did this, because the fact is no one else but a United States official who's privy to uh, special intelligence information uh, actually gave that information out well before anybody else in the world knew it. And that's why we know the United States did this. And when it comes down to it, we need to understand that basically this was the act of the United States. And guess what ended up happening? A bunch of people actually in the hospitals died just because of it. You essentially killed a bunch of innocent people in the hospitals just because you wanted regime change. This is basically, hey, let's kill a bunch of people just because we want to put our guy in. Now, that's not exactly talking about, oh, we care about the Venezuelan people. No, you don't. You don't care about the Venezuelan people because you just killed a bunch of them. If you actually cared about them, you'd actually try to work with them through ideas and not work with this Juan Guaido thug who actually is a tyrant. He might say he's a capitalist with it, but he's not. He's for regime change. He's for a violent overthrow, because he stated that he wants to commit violence if Maduro does not give him his presidential seat, which was never voted on. Mind you, there's never been any election. Juan Guaido has never been elected, and the supporters are about 700 people for Juan Guaido to be president. That's almost nobody. And you could say, and they've brought out with the numbers. You could say that people don't support Maduro, but that does not mean that they don't support Guaido. And even with the numbers that even still support Maduro, when it comes down to it, for the actual people that are happy with Maduro, that's still basically, we're talking well over 100 times the amount that supports Guaido. There's what it called. He's basically trounced in support by Maduro, and that means with the other people in the country are actually totally on a different foot. But what's on this point is what we need to understand is that you don't want to be committing criminal acts. And what this goes back to is this goes back to the person who's controlling national security, because that's eventually who's the actual one who's in charge of all of this. That's John Bolton. John Bolton essentially committed a war act. He's basically guilty, just like the actual envoy to the region, which would be Elliot Abrams, who basically just did another one, and just like he did in Central America, and just as well as the CIA, and that goes against uh, and that would be Gina Haspel. And Gina Haspel, as we know, is guilty of torture, but she was able to allow to shred her own documents so she can say it never happened. And when we look at this, we can see that basically these are the three people who did it. Person who basically put false information to get us into Iraq. One of four people, being Colin Powell, being Benjamin Netanyahu, being Dick Cheney, and himself. And then you also have the fact of Elliot Abrams basically was responsible for all the bloodshed with the Iran Contra deal that essentially led to over 300,000 people dead. And you also have the case of Gina Haspel, who was responsible for torturing people, and not just using waterboarding. She was using other methods as well. And she basically there's pictures of her uh, basically showing thumbs up next to victims being tortured. So she is definitely a sick individual. And these are the people that are actually involved in this. So basically, they don't care that innocent people are dying, just as long as they can actually put in their proxy leader. That's basically going to essentially follow everything that the Western countries want, which means they're essentially trying to do what the Brits did with Idi Amin, and that's basically what he's going to be, what they're going to have out there. Now, when it comes down to is this is what we're talking about as a criminal case. Is this essentially, when we view this as a criminal case, is those are really the three people who are with it, and you got to follow it up from the actual people who have the intelligence. Now, this is a person we had a moron in Marco Rubio to actually release this stuff to actually show that the United States was involved, and those are the people, and that led us to realize that the fact is that the U.S. was involved in this thing, and we know Trump has kind of ignored a lot of these details and said, well, this is not the thing that I really know much about. And it's really kind of linking up to a lot of the stuff that George W. Bush did the with during his presidency, and handing things over to other people and not even knowing what was happening. And I think this is the problem that Trump is having. And he's saying, well, this guy was on Fox. He must know what he's talking about. Well, the fact is if Trump would have realized John Bolton was essentially one of the major people to push for the Iraq War, and that person, when you go over to when we talk about being real good friends with Israel, well, that guy was another guy that was key in the Iraq War as well. So if you're against the Iraq War, I mean, you need to really think about what we're actually doing, and if you really stand against that, these are the people that you should not be friends with. And when people are saying that are starting to question the actual points of should we actually be involved in these wars, and basically and the idea of questioning a relationship with a country that's forcing us to basically do their bidding is not anti-Semitism either. And when it comes down to it, is this is what's happening is we're having a handful of people control 100% of the intelligence in Congress. So they're creating this false illusion of what Israel really is and what some of these other countries really are. And basically, when it comes down to it, is they feed this kind of line of BS because no one else is allowed to see any of this information. and they have to just vote on what they either a what they think it is, if they're skeptical, or b what these people are saying it is. And you don't and because these people are kind of groomed by these neoconservative think tanks, you essentially are kind of basically up a creek without a paddle when it comes down to this. Now, if they would actually give the information to everyone, which is really what you should be doing, because I believe that we're a representative republic and everybody should be privy to that information, because you should have access to having your representative have all the information and being able to make a legitimate case for your representative to make these calls. But the fact is, they don't. They only have certain people do it because they know that it would have an actual massive impact, and they only want certain people to get this access. And it's a small number of people, and this has been brought up for basically from a big time with it for well over a decade. And when it comes down to it, we understand. This is why we understand why they do it, is because if they did bring up to everyone these events like this type of garbage like this wouldn't be allowed to happen, because they would essentially be calling that an act of war before it actually happens, and they would actually be essentially calling for this to stop before it happens, and they would be essentially calling for the actual removal of funds from these departments, which would essentially, such as the State Department, such as the CIA, and they would start stripping funds, which would cause them to have to rethink what they're doing. And they couldn't be doing these things then. And people would start thinking about thinking about getting rid of civilian intelligence. And they'd say, with it, we don't need civilian intelligence because this is the garbage that they're doing. I mean, look at the CIA. Whether the CIA doesn't do anything worthwhile, the CIA is just about basically causing problems around the globe and ensuring that the military contractors try to clean it up with it so then they can sell more weapons. And it's a whole big circle. And frankly, when it comes down to the people are sick and tired of paying for it. And that's really what ends up going on. And this is what ends up why people end up being mad as hell. Because the fact is we end up keep paying for it, and then they go, oh, there's no such thing as blowback. Really? No, we just have to keep fighting off more terrorists and all these other things. No, that's what blowback is. You create more terrorists, you idiots. And when you start killing people's families, that's when you create more terrorism, and you cause this problem to get 10 times worse than it really needs to be. Because the fact is they don't want to admit that terrorism has begun since 1 AD, and they don't want to admit that. And the fact is you see a huge spike the more you actually attack and kill people. The more strikes you do, the more it kills more innocent people. The numbers of percentage-wise of what these actual strikes kill when it comes to the actual innocent people is about 90% of these strike victims are actually innocent civilians. Well, you have to understand when it's that high, you're talking that basically those are going to be people who those relatives of those people are going to become terrorists, because they're going to say, this government killed my family, and they're going to want revenge. And that's what's always going to happen. And that's not a terrorist, that's basically a normal person. They're going to say, I want revenge. And basically, if some other country comes over to here and someone kills your family, you're going to want revenge too. That's precisely why actually we have the death penalty, is because most people say they want it because they want revenge on their actual family being killed. and that's on their family members being killed, and that's the sole reason why they want it. So if we're trying to state that we want to go over there to kill these terrorists with it, well, when it comes down to it, we're essentially with these what we're doing, we're essentially creating this same whole huge problem. And every time we do this, basically 9 out of every 10 people we kill are innocent civilians, and basically just to kill that one target. And when we could have just gone on the ground and actually killed them easily, because they were within a group of 10 of actual 10 civilians, just to kill that one person. Now you're gonna actually go up in a plane and blow up 10 people. Really makes a lot of sense. And you could easily just arrest the person and actually put them through an actual trial system. This is why when we talk about this, we need to act in a rational manner, and that's why we do this. Because frankly, if when you go on feelings, you end up creating these irrational things with it, which is like we're bombing these groups of people to go after one person. Well, that makes no sense. It's like trying to rob a bank with a nuclear warhead. That's overkill. I mean, you don't exactly need that. I mean, it's totally excessive. And when we look at things, we need to say, does this actually benefit your actual country and its sovereignty? And if it doesn't, don't do it. And this is why when it comes down to this is we don't need to actually be out in Venezuela. There's no benefits to the actual people of the United States. And when there's no benefits, we don't even need to be there. Let them solve their own problems. Every country needs to solve their own problems. The United States is not there to solve the world's problems. If you want to help them out, you help them out through charity work. Go in there with it. Say you're there. Say you're there from an actual charity group to help bring in water and food and medicine and all these other things like this. Bring in Doctors Without Borders if you're worried about medicine. Bring in different Christian groups if you're worried about them not having like the food or any of these other things like this. I'm sure that Maduro would be more than happy to bring them in. But when it comes from the actual federal government for the United States, who basically has in the past used this as a ruse to actually overturn governments such as Libya, such as they tried in Syria, such as Iraq, guess what's going to happen? They're going to act every single time uh, these people have actually had their governments overthrown, and then when it comes to actually negotiations for like peace deals, when you tell someone to give up all their weapons such as nuclear weapons, guess what's happened in the past? They've actually been told, oh, give up all your nukes and we won't harm you. Well, guess what's happened within about a month? Yeah, they're dead, because the fact is we went in and we wiped them out. Well, that's because we didn't keep our actual word. When our word doesn't mean when our word doesn't mean anything, why are they actually going to trust us? That's why Kim Jong Un up in North Korea doesn't trust us on anything, and he's not going to sign up on a deal. And especially when we have John Bolton putting poison pills in the actual deal to make sure it doesn't get signed off on, it's going to cause that problem. And he basically he doesn't want the actual peace deals. This is just what he does. And what needs to happen is we need to understand that this is what's going to occur under him. Is he doesn't like peace. He likes war. And he only likes war with it, and he'll only be light with it when it comes down to what he knows he can get away with. And if he knows he can't get away with it at a certain time he's not going to use it. But his idea right now is to overthrow Iran, overthrow North Korea, and he wants to overthrow Venezuela. And those are the three right now that he wants to do. And he also wants to use NATO to harass Russia. And he knows he has a bunch of morons out in Congress who, from the Democratic side, who are on this whole thing of Russia influenced the election when there's no actual proof, and he has to mix in with the neoconservative Republicans to buy in the Russia's a huge threat garbage, and it's enough to basically ensure that no change to NATO can actually happen. That you can't get rid of NATO, and he knows that NATO can still be used to harass Russia, and that NATO can still be used as a huge defense contractor slush fund. And when we look at basically this case of who's to blame, we can't blame the actual country because to this date, under socialism, they have not had an electronics failure when it comes down to the power grid. They've never had one. So we have to go with, so we know that it's not part of their incompetency. Uh, and we know that we know that it's not even normal for them to have it, and for a whole country to have it. That's completely irrational. For that to, without something suspicious, and I think this is where we need to realize that something suspicious happened, and the reason why he rightfully attacked the United States is because the United States has floated the idea of countries can actually do this. And when the United States tried to accuse of Russia or China thinking about doing it to the United States, well, we know that they wouldn't have any interest in doing. China wouldn't, because China relies on the United States market to essentially boost their market, because the United States is a huge consumer, and Russia has no need to, because Russia does not want to start World War III. So the United States is the one acting as an actual aggressor, and the United States would be the one actually using this power to do so. And that means the United States was already aware that this could actually be done, and this would have been back as early as 2014 when they were starting to make mention of this. So people like Marco Rubio that actually had made statements in advance, stating that the backup generators had failed. Guess what? Marco Rubio just essentially incriminated every freaking person who was basically privy to that knowledge of intelligence, because they knew about it and they didn't blow the whistle. And then all of those people in civilian intelligence who are acting upon this, because nothing in military intelligence was doing this. Nobody in our military intelligence nor our military were actually doing this. They were basically standing around, acting as security at best. When what the actual people that were doing this would have been in CIA or part of the national security apparatus from our civilian intelligence. They're actually trying to hack into stuff. Most likely through the CIA itself, though. And that's what we're talking about here, and that needs to be understood, is that what he did there was essentially call out the people who did this by giving out this information that was only known to those people who essentially committed this crime. And this is an actual crime, and that is essentially an act of war. You cannot do that. That's essentially, when you do that act of war, guess what happens with it is you essentially are risking another country attacking you because you the horrible act that you've actually done. So when we're talking about this, this is basically what we need to realize is these are the people that essentially need to essentially go, and we need to get these civilian intelligence agencies. They just need to disappear. Number one, we just need to essentially just get rid of them. We need to get rid of these neoconservatives. They just need to go. This is why their magazines are going anyway. No actual people actually believe in this garbage as regular people. I mean, they think it's complete hogwash. I mean, Bill Crystal can't sell anything out there. I mean, he's probably selling himself on the street as we know right now with it, because he's basically, his name's worth nothing beyond him being an actual brought on by these left wing uh, TV stations for being anti-Trump. The moment that this anti-Trump thing basically becomes nothing with it, he's going to become a nobody, and people are basically going to drop him like a hot potato, and he's going to be worth nothing because no one's going to want to hear from him because he's a complete and utter moron. And since neoconservatism is dead, the same thing when it comes down to uh, let me see, who's the other one that I was thinking of. Stephen Hayes is another one that would be another one that would be neoconservative that definitely needs to go. That he'll likely not last. Because I mean, people just don't. People just don't trust him anymore. I mean, you have. I mean, basically, you have basically the only ones you have left that actually go on neoconservative anymore is Commentary, a magazine, which is from the American Jewish Committee, uh, and it's basically and it's that's that you have that with it, but the Public Interest, which is one of them, that went out in 2005. The Washington Free Beacon, which is essentially, that's considered kind of like small time at best, and not many people read it. And then the Weekly Standard essentially ceased in December 2018, not long ago. So basically, they only have a couple of them left. So they're basically going out like it's basically pretty much, it's there's losing out like a lot of people. So obviously they still have their certain people out there that are out that are still personalities, but they're not what it called. They're not basically. They're pretty much their actual movement is dying out. They have Michael Rubin, Jennifer Rubin, uh, who are major people. Jonah Goldberg tends to go in between, so he's kind of sort of on the idea with it. Sometimes he'll end up going with neoconservatism, sometimes not. But when it comes down to obviously you have Elliot Abrams, John Bolton, Bill Kristol, Scooter Libby, Paul Wolfowitz, and for politicians, George W. Bush, Jeb Bush, Dick Cheney, Liz Cheney, Joe Lieberman. You did have John McCain. You have Marco Rubio, Lindsey Graham, Mike Pompeo, and Mitt Romney. So you're not exactly keeping up with most of them what you used to. So when it comes down to it, is that movement is really dying. Next to obviously your liberty movement with Republicans. And which is obviously you're going to find a lot of people with that um, that are that are rising with that. With it, they tend to go under like the Ron Paul type of ideas, and these are a lot of non-interventionists. Ron Paul, Rand Paul, Thomas Massey, Justin Amash, and there's a lot of people rising up through this. A lot, basically, this is the whole idea of the Tea Party, and these people essentially are essentially where the actual run. It seems like where they're actually going. And when it comes down to it, is neoconservatism will die out, and it's not gonna take much longer because these people, they're not getting any younger people into neoconservatism because it's this like old it's that's that like old man's party type of thing, and since it's against liberty, and their whole idea is to push this idea of we have to get them before they get us on the terrorism instead of looking at things with logic. It's really kind of not being able to grasp onto younger people. So you tend to get people from at least from the mid 40s and up, and so it's basically going to go downhill from here, and there's not going to be many people left, and it's just going to keep going into the basement. I mean, Marco Rubio's would be probably the youngest person there in the neoconservative camp. Uh, obviously, there's Tom Cotton as well with it, which is kind of rare that you find an actual military member that believes in this because usually they have self-preservation. But when we see this with it, we're not going to find. It's pretty much when it comes down to it. Eventually, we're going to get to the point of these cases where we're not going to find people who are going to embrace these type of ideas anymore. Now, if you like this video, like, subscribe, click the notification bell. Make sure that you subscribe to me, obviously. Make sure that you're trying to get other people to subscribe to me by sharing this all the way around. Make sure you share it publicly, share it with your friends as well. Make sure that check out my Patreon, which is right below here. Make sure that you see if your friends can check out my Patreon as well, because that's how I'm going to be able to get money currently, because I'm not up to the advertising level. And that's about it. Bye, everyone.